Raise your hand. Austin?
I just asked Josh about the addition of Colton Hood with Jermod's situation, now Boo's situation. Like, how have you seen him come in? What you've seen out of him this summer? What makes you think he can step right in and be an instant impact guy for you all?
Yeah, we're excited about Hood, to say the least, and I think it just starts with the process, getting to know him. He's extremely competitive. He's a kid who understands, there's a process to everything that you do, and he's really working at it. So I think he's fit in with our guys in our group. He's super hungry, but he's really smart. And like I said, just the competitive nature that he brings to the room. Obviously he's got to do it here at the University of Tennessee, but based on everything we've seen this summer, again, how he's fit in with everybody, how hard he's worked, we have no doubt that he'll be able to help us in some capacity.
Brett?
As a follow-up in the secondary, will you work Hood and Beasley at multiple spots throughout fall camp to try to create depth? How do you kind of manage that room back there now with so many young guys and then obviously the uncertainty of a couple guys?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things we've prided ourselves in, teaching guys not just how to play defensive back, but, every position, in terms of whether it's a star, whether it's a safety, whether it's a corner spot. So obviously guys have unique skill sets that you try to play to their strengths. You mentioned Beasley, he's definitely had a chance to play some star in the spring. He's also played some safety. We think he's a guy who brings great, versatility to the position. So, but we're mixing a lot of guys there, if we're being honest and being frank. We're excited about, you mentioned Colton Hood, you talk about Jalen McMurray, even William Wright. We've had, numerous guys that have gotten some reps at that spot. So it's our job right now between Coach Martinez, Coach E.T., and those guys to figure out to put the best guys in the best spots, to be the most valuable that they can be to this team.
Vince?
Coach Bing, back here.
You're usually over here somewhere.
I know.
Sitting back there. But, okay. Yeah.
I got downgraded. So your linebacker position, obviously, with Carter and T-Lander, those are known commodities that you want to take the next step. Pretty young and inexperienced behind that. What do you think of those other guys in that linebacking room?
Yeah, I think the first guy that comes to mind is Edwin Spillman. Spillman had a really good spring for us. He's exactly what we're looking for in terms of, just understanding standards and living by day, just the way he comes to work every day. Great leadership skills. Another guy, Jordan Burns, who's gotten, significantly better, over the past year and a half. So, we're excited about those guys. Brendan Ames showed some things as well during spring. He's a guy who has a great combination of size and athleticism. And then we got obviously a couple young guys between Herman and Pilates. So, yeah, we're obviously going to be young there, but we feel like, from a talent perspective, we're probably even deeper than we've been in the past, just off pure talent.
Adam, then Rob?
When you're talking about moving guys around, as you guys do in the secondary, like, how much movement is too much movement in camp? In other words, when do you need to decide this guy needs to dedicate himself to star or corner or safety?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've obviously had from, right after the season to weightlifting, right before spring ball, you start going through installs and things of that nature. You obviously have spring, then you have the summer ball, and then obviously we're going into fall camp. So, we've had some moments, to be able to teach, and evaluate. Obviously, as the bullets start to fly, as you start to put more on their plate, you get a better idea who can handle what, and who obviously needs to be at what position. So I think that's always a work in progress, but we've got some really resilient kids, some extremely smart kids, and very competitive kids. So those guys, want the challenge. They want opportunities to play multiple spots. But again, at some point we'll obviously figure out, who's best at what, and we'll go from there.
You guys obviously had a few key losses up, up front on the edge, but in this day and age with player movement, is it a luxury to bring back the kind of experience you did in, Bryson, Jackson, Joshua Joseph, those kind of guys? Yeah, we're excited about them. We feel like we've built a really good culture around here, and, it's refreshing that guys want to be a part of it. Our front, we got a lot of guys, that obviously hasn't played a lot, but we do have some key figures that have played a lot of snaps, significant snaps. So, it's up to those guys to continue to, move the needle, so to speak, to bring those other guys along. But, yeah, it's been awesome. But I think that's a tribute to the culture we've built here on defense and, Coach
and obviously what Coach Hype has done, overall as a team.
To the back, Rick, then Paige.
Hey, Tim. It's an exciting time, but it's also a difficult time. As a coach, how do you prepare your guys for the grind of fall camp?
Yeah, we like to think we've been working at it again, since spring ball, understanding what was ahead of us, understanding how fast this thing comes. But it's not hard, man. These kids love ball. They love football. They're excited about it. They can't wait to get down there. If anything, it's us trying to slow them down a little bit, not trying to get it all done in one day. But that's what you want as a coach. You want guys that are eager and excited about the opportunity. But it's been fun. It really is. Like I said, we have a really good mix of older guys with a lot of talented young guys new to the program. But, the way these guys have hit the ground running since spring ball, I know they can't wait to get going, and neither can we.
Earlier in the spring, there we go. Earlier in the spring, Edwin Spillman said that his pass rush and blitzing technique will be special in the fall. How much are you seeing that be confirmed during practice or expectations-wise for the fall?
Yeah. All those backers want to pressure and blitz, so I'm not surprised he said that. There's a lot of them saying the same thing. But, yeah, they'll get their opportunities. We're a pressure team, and, we want athletic linebackers that can win one-on-ones. And, he's definitely worked his tail off during spring, to kind of sharpen some of the technique and the fundamentals that come with being a great pass rusher. So, no, it's exciting. You want guys that believe in themselves and are confident, and obviously, showing it in practice day in and day out, it'll be the proof in the pudding.
Staying in the back, Casey.
Why do you, back here. Why do you think that Jeremiah and Ariane have been so effective in pushing each other to be better?
Man, those guys are just uberly competitive. They want to win. Just watch these young guys, how they've matured over the last couple years. And that's what you want. You want your linebackers to be the tip of the spear, guys that can lead, guys that are high communicators, and both those guys have that. You look at T. Lander, he's a coach's kid. That's what you expected. That's what you expect. Obviously with Ariane, the amount of snaps he's played, he's earned that right. So both of those guys have been outstanding since, again, spring ball. And even before that, you talk about the fourth quarter workouts. Those guys have been tremendous leaders and great ambassadors for our program. So I think both of those guys are primed for great years. And, just because of the energy and the work that they put in it, they can't help but lead, and the guys are following.
To the left with Ben, then Austin.
Tim, what does Josh Josephs need to do now that he's kind of the old head at that position to take the next step in his career? And with Caleb Herring, what does he need to do to become a more consistent contributor?
Yeah, I think for Josh is just to continue to do what he's been doing. He's been extremely good for us in the run game. When you go back and you watch the cut-ups and you see how valuable he was in the run game, we kind of felt that way, but to get proof of concept is another thing, and he did it in spades for us. I think as he just continues to, be the vocal leader, I think when he got here, I think Josh would tell you, he was quiet, kind of to himself. But you see him being a lot more vocal, a lot more to the point with the younger guys. It's only helped us. You mentioned Caleb Herring. I think for Caleb it's just staying healthy, and he's worked his tail off to do his part for it. And so far it's been great. So, we feel really blessed to have both of those guys, and, we're clearly expecting big things from both of those guys, high returns.
Tim, when you got here, you inherited a bit of a mess on defense, and statistically every year you've been better. Last year being the best. What gives you a thought process that this defense can be even better than last year's defense?
Yeah, not to be cliche on you, but we look at every year as a new year, and I think that's why we've been able to build the culture the way we've built it. We don't necessarily talk a lot about what we did last year or where we need to go as a unit, because it's a different team. There are obviously some things that you look at statistically where you can be better, you ask yourself, is it scheme, is it personnel, how can we be better as coaches? But to a man, those guys understand this is a new year, and I think because we have that starting fresh, starting over, adhering to the process, and working, step by step, day by day to get better, I think that's always helped us, in the way we've been able to grow, just because we know no sacks, no interceptions, no tackle for losses, or pay dividends on this year, and those guys understand that, and I think that's why we've been good.
What's the next step for Ricky, and as he goes from a first-year starter and now it goes to pursue even bigger things?
Yeah, you just watch Ricky's confidence grow throughout the course of the season last year, and it was no different during spring ball. He's got a great quiet confidence about him. It was always a thought that he could do it, but for him to do it and do it at the level he did, I think it only breeds confidence for him. And again, you know, when you play on that back end, confidence is everything, you know, and I think even a younger corner, seeing how he goes about his business has only helped that room. But I think for him, you know, he's gotten a lot stronger. You know, he's really, you know, paid the price in the weight room and off the field with, you know, all the things he needed to do to be a stronger defensive back. And I think you will see, you know, that come to fruition in terms of how he plays. You'll be able to see the strength in which he plays with. But yeah, I think he's just scratching the surface, if I'm being honest. You know, I think he can be even better, you know, and I know he wants to be, you know, and he's continuing to work at it.
I'm curious, now that your culture is established, you have your identity on defense. When you do a self-scout, is it different now than it was year 2 to year 3? And what are you looking for when you did your self-scout? What do you want to improve this year compared to previously?
Yeah, I think for us, you know, when you look at the self-scout, you know, it always comes down to, you know, are we playing winning football? You know, what do we need to do to win? And I think at the end of the day, whether you're talking our first year here or, you know, 3 years after that, you know, we've always tried to play to the strengths of our players first and foremost, put those guys in the best situation to be successful. And as you evaluate it, you ask yourself, did you do that? We felt like we did that in a lot of ways. You know, there are obviously some things we think we can still be better at. You know, whether you're talking about, you know, 1st and 10 defense, you know, whether you're talking about, you know, continue to be even better in the red zone, you know, because again, as good as you are, you know, when we look at that tape, we're like, man, if we had just executed a little bit better here, we'll be even better. So I don't know that there's some real big action items outside of, you know, just continuing to grow and make sure, again, as we identify who we are from a personnel group. Now the next question is always, well, how do we play to their strengths, put these guys in the best situations to play winning football?
Tim, a lot of turnover at the safety position, but you do bring back Andre, old head in the room. What are your expectations for him, not only on the field, but, you know, leading some underclassmen that are going to have to step up and play?
Yeah, I know we mentioned Arion and mentioned T-Land. You know, I put Dre in that same conversation. He's been awesome, you know, from a leadership perspective. You know, he's definitely been a voice in that room. You know, he's got great work ethic. I think his body has changed. I think he's gotten stronger, or I know he's gotten stronger, and, you know, we'll see him continue to play with even greater confidence. You know, last year, you know, I think was his first year, you know, fully starting the whole year, and he did a lot of really good things for us. But, you know, as we watch the tape and some of the private conversations we've had, I think he understands there's still some meat on the bone and some things that he can do better. But where he is right now today as a leader has been outstanding. You know, he's what you're looking for. You know, he's a kid that gets it. You talk about, you know, being able to play the strengths and, you know, scheme-wise, you know, he's a kid that can digest it, you know, and be able to articulate it. So, you know, he's one of the guys you can kick the scheme around to. And if he doesn't understand it, then there's a good chance nobody will understand it. So he's kind of been the sounding board for us as a coaching staff and the back end.
Patrick and Ryan.
Sticking at safety, what kind of growth have you seen from Idris over his time here over the last couple of seasons as he goes to maybe a bigger role this year?
Yeah, really, really good. You know, Idris has always been a 100 miles an hour guy, you know, great physicality. You know, he's a guy that's selfless, you know, that again embodies what we want to be on defense. So, you know, we're excited. He had a really good spring for us. It was consistent. You know, he worked on some of the things that he felt like he needed, that we identified that he needed to work on coming out of last fall. And he addressed it, you know, so we're really excited about him, like we really are. You know, I put him, you know, I think he'll be what Dre is, you know, in terms of being a guy that's super sharp, that's able to communicate the defense. We think he's cut from that same cloth. He just needs the opportunities. And, you know, as long as he continues to do what he did in the spring, you know, he'll have those opportunities.
You touched on Arion and sort of the way he's approached things. Anything you've seen from his game, you know, since the spring and just throughout the offseason in terms of how he can kind of take the next step as a linebacker, or anything that you think he might have improved on?
Yeah, I mean, I think just, again, being more vocal, you know, not being afraid to hold guys accountable has been awesome. You know, that can be extremely uncomfortable for people in general, and when you're talking about young people, but he's really embraced that role. You know, I think his body, you know, look, his body has changed a little bit. He's noticeably bigger and stronger. So we're definitely looking forward to seeing, you know, a guy with that type of instincts, that type of grasp of the defense, you know, and now that size and combination of power, just kind of seeing what it looks like when he puts it all together this fall. So I think he's in a really good place for us right now. And like I said, we're expecting really big things from him.
All right. Thank you, Coach.